Long before the world came to know Meghan Markle as a duchess wrapped in centuries-old royal protocol, before her name was attached to blockbuster Netflix contracts and headline-making memoirs, she was simply another actress grinding away in Los Angeles. No titles, no palaces, no camera flashes chronicling her every step. Just Meghan, driven, sharp-witted, and, depending on whom you ask, remarkably adept at becoming precisely who she needed to be to get ahead. It's almost easy to overlook that before she ever stepped into the corridors of British royalty, she spent her days navigating the punishing hustle of Hollywood. Instead of press tours and photo calls, there were no-name casting calls, side gigs, waiting tables, and the constant sting of being overlooked. Back then, Meghan's life revolved around relentless effort, taking any role she could to keep her name alive in an industry famous for discarding hopefuls without a second thought. But woven into that lesser-seen chapter of her past is a name most people don't recognize: Trevor Engelson. Not an aristocrat or a royal insider, just a producer who had established himself in entertainment circles, and the man who witnessed her transformation before the rest of the world ever caught on. For Trevor, their time together would become a memory etched with both devotion and disbelief. Their paths first crossed in the mid-2000s, in the kind of dimly lit bar where countless Hollywood stories are born. Everyone who was around them says their connection was instant. Trevor had already built some credibility as a producer with an eye for talent. Meghan, barely in her 20s, was still in the thick of the uphill climb, stringing together minor credits and hoping for that elusive breakout. What started out as occasional dates quickly became something much deeper. Friends at the time recalled how inseparable they seemed. Two ambitious dreamers bracing against rejection and disappointment together. They shared apartments, work frustrations, and hopes of building a life that might look very different from the one they were living. In 2011, after nearly 7 years of partnership, they married in Jamaica. It wasn't some splashy Hollywood wedding. It was intimate, simple, and seemingly sincere. But almost from the moment her career started to accelerate, so did the distance between them. It began subtly, an unreturned call here, a distracted conversation there. Trevor kept making trips to Toronto, where Meghan was filming Suits, determined to keep their bond strong. He'd send thoughtful gifts, write her notes, do anything to remind her that he was still there, rooting for her. But she often seemed mentally elsewhere, her mind already on the next goal she was determined to reach. There was no dramatic explosion to mark the end, no affair exposed or scandal splashed across tabloids. The separation came in a single, jarring gesture. Meghan packaged up her wedding ring and mailed it back to Trevor with no message, no farewell. Just a box that quietly announced their marriage was over. People who knew Trevor then all say the same thing. He didn't just feel heartbroken, he felt blindsided. For years, he'd built his life around the idea that they were partners in everything, that their sacrifices were mutual. He was her husband, the person she confided in, or at least the one she allowed to see part of her reality. And it was one of those confidences that would come back to haunt him in a way he never anticipated. According to those closest to him, Meghan had shared something profound during their marriage. She said she wouldn't be able to have children. It wasn't a throwaway comment. It was, as Trevor understood it, a defining truth they'd have to accept together. He never questioned her honesty. He simply embraced the life they thought was ahead. So imagine what it felt like years later to see her standing proudly next to Prince Harry, announcing pregnancies to a captivated world. It wasn't bitterness that filled him. It was something harder to define. A cold realization that maybe the most important promise she ever made to him hadn't been the whole truth. Even then, he didn't rush to the nearest reporter. He didn't write an exposé or sit down for a lucrative interview. He did what he'd always done. He processed it quietly, leaning only on a few trusted confidants. Meanwhile, Meghan's reputation continued to ascend. Every photo shoot, every charity speech, every well-timed public appearance reinforcing the image of a woman who had finally found her purpose. It's no wonder that so many people feel unsettled when they hear Trevor's story. Forces an uncomfortable question. Can someone be entirely sincere and still hold back the parts of themselves that don't fit the version they want you to see? Trevor's experience, and the murmurs from others who knew Meghan before she was royal, suggests there isn't an easy answer. Those who worked with her on sets before Harry came into the picture describe her the same way. Warm, disarmingly charming, but also laser-focused. She could win over a casting director in a few minutes flat. She could inspire loyalty from the crew without even trying. And when you were in her orbit, it felt like you mattered. But if her goals shifted, so did her attention. Trevor came to understand this the hard way. One moment, he was the partner she leaned on in her lowest moments. The next, she was navigating exclusive Hollywood circles with a confidence that felt foreign to him. Watching her step into the royal world was like watching someone erase every trace of who they'd been together. And that, more than the ending itself, was what hurt the most. Not just that she left, but that she seemed to shed her past as easily as slipping out of a costume she no longer needed. While Trevor nursed the wounds of a marriage that dissolved without warning, Meghan's career continued in full force. She wrapped up her run on Suits, launched a personal blog, and started lending her name to causes she cared about. By the time she met Harry, she had mastered the delicate art of public relations. When their relationship became public, the narrative practically wrote itself. An American actress and a British prince, rewriting royal tradition with every step they took. Yet beneath the fairy tale packaging, there was a pattern that some couldn't ignore. Every stage of Meghan's ascent was orchestrated with remarkable precision. Every obstacle became another opportunity to pivot her story. Every person who no longer fit the next act seemed to quietly disappear from her life. There's nothing inherently wrong with ambition. Reinventing yourself isn't a crime. Everyone has the right to grow. But when each reinvention leaves someone behind, eventually people start to question how authentic any of it ever was. One person who worked closely with her once said she was always thinking 5 moves ahead. Another called her the most attentive person you'd ever meet, until she decided to move on. These weren't accusations of malice. They were simply observations of someone determined to survive in an industry that demands constant reinvention. When Meghan and Harry sat down with Oprah for that now-famous interview, millions watched her describe the pain she endured. Racism, isolation, depression. For many, it was heartbreaking to hear. But for those who knew her before she was a duchess, it sparked a different thought. Was this another well-prepared version of her story, another chapter in an ongoing reinvention? Through it all, Trevor never issued a rebuttal. He didn't contradict her account or attempt to hijack her moment. He remained largely silent, perhaps because he knew the truth was too complicated to fit into a neat soundbite. It's easy to dismiss his story as the bitterness of an ex. But Trevor wasn't broke. He wasn't chasing relevance. When he once pitched a TV project about a man whose ex-wife married royalty, he eventually decided against pursuing it. Maybe he understood that no amount of fiction could soften the sting of what he'd lived through. So he stayed quiet. He watched her rise from afar, observed her documentaries, her public appearances, her new carefully curated identity, and he held on to the memories that never made it into any of her interviews. Over time, whispers began to spread. Whether it was because the public had grown skeptical or simply because too many conflicting narratives were colliding, Trevor's version of events finally began to seep into the public consciousness. It wasn't a deliberate smear campaign. It was the natural outcome of unanswered questions refusing to stay buried. That's why this story matters. It's not about whether Meghan is a hero or a villain. It's about the tension between carefully edited public images and the private truths that can never be fully controlled. Some call her strategic, others call her resilient. But one thing is undeniable. None of this happened by accident. Every reinvention was intentional. And maybe that's why people can't stop talking about it. Because this isn't simply about a broken marriage. It's about how a narrative can look perfect, until the quiet recollections of someone who knew you before the spotlight begin to surface. Those recollections don't come roaring out of the tabloids. They slip in softly, a reminder that behind every meticulously arranged brand is a real person who once felt overlooked, hurt, or forgotten. Trevor's story doesn't shatter Meghan's legend, but it does crack the surface just enough to remind us that even the most polished image can never erase the past entirely. And when those quiet truths finally come to light, they don't just challenge the public's perception. They force everyone, including Meghan herself, to consider a question far more complicated than any headline can answer. Who are you when no one is watching, and who gets to tell that version of your story? There's something universally unsettling about realizing that someone you loved was always one step ahead, always preparing for a life you couldn't see coming. For Trevor, that realization didn't crash over him all at once, crept in slowly, like a draft sneaking under a door. One day, he woke up and understood that the person he thought he knew so intimately had already turned the page, and he was still stuck in the last chapter. He often wondered if there had been signs he missed. Was it the way she grew quiet when he talked about the future? Or the polite smile she gave when he spoke about starting a family? A look he'd convinced himself was simply exhaustion from long filming days? The hardest part was realizing those moments were probably never accidental. People close to Meghan would argue that she did what she had to do to survive in an industry that rewards reinvention, that she was no different from countless others who learned early that sentimentality can slow you down. But for Trevor, those justifications didn't soften the sting of feeling disposable. And that's the paradox of ambition. Can be admirable and necessary, the engine that drives people to outwork and outlast the competition. But it can also become a shield, one that keeps you from ever letting anyone get close enough to see where the performance ends and the truth begins. Over the years, as Meghan's platform grew, Trevor sometimes heard her described as a role model for women everywhere, a symbol of independence and resilience. And in quieter moments, he'd admit he admired that. He'd seen firsthand how hard she fought to be more than a background player in someone else's story. But admiration doesn't erase confusion, and respect doesn't erase the quiet ache of feeling like a stepping stone to someone else's destiny. That's why his story feels different from tabloid gossip. It's not driven by spite, it's driven by the simple need to understand. People who watched Meghan's ascent have their own theories about when she decided she was meant for something bigger than acting. Some point to her blog, The Tig, where she wrote about finding purpose beyond Hollywood. Others say it started even earlier, that she'd always known she would someday break into a world far beyond television. What's undeniable is how seamlessly she transitioned from the role of TV star to Duchess. Almost overnight, the woman who once hustled for guest spots on cable shows was shaking hands with heads of state and delivering speeches about humanitarian causes. For many, it was inspiring. For others, it was bewildering. How could someone transform so completely and never seem to look back? That question still shadows her story to this day. It's not that Meghan's success was unearned. She worked tirelessly, endured rejection, and fought for her place in the spotlight. But the cost of that climb, the relationship she left behind, the truths she set aside, has never been fully accounted for. Even now, when people discuss Trevor, there's a tendency to downplay his role as just an early chapter in Meghan's life. But for him, it wasn't just a footnote. It was years of shared dreams, countless sacrifices, and a love that, for a time, felt unshakable. And maybe that's the most disorienting part of all this. The idea that someone could share your life so fully, only to later act as though it never really happened. As if those years were merely rehearsals for a bigger performance. In Hollywood, stories like that are almost a cliché. One person moves on, the other becomes an anecdote. But when your former partner ascends to one of the most public positions on earth, the sense of erasure is magnified 1,000 times. Trevor never asked to be part of the global conversation about Meghan Markle. He never courted fame or peddled his story for clicks. But when people started to piece together the timeline, the sudden divorce, the quiet confessions, the carefully curated reinventions, his perspective became impossible to ignore. The most fascinating aspect isn't whether Meghan intentionally misled Trevor about her future. It's how little she seemed to look back once she'd made her decision. It's the speed and certainty with which she cut ties, mailed back her ring, and stepped into the next phase of her life. That clarity of purpose, that willingness to close one door before the next even opened, is what made her so successful. But it's also what left people like Trevor feeling like they'd been edited out of their own lives. Some might call that cold, others might call it necessary. But either way, it's a reminder that even the most empowering stories have shadows. Moments when ambition collides with empathy, and empathy doesn't always win. In the years since, Trevor has built a quiet life, largely removed from the frenzy that surrounds Meghan. He has no interest in reliving those days, no desire to dissect every headline. But every now and then, when the past resurfaces, he's forced to reckon with the simple truth that some stories never really end. They just wait, patient and unresolved, for the moment when someone finally decides to tell them.